continue to excel in this unique tourist experience. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Lunenburg West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to take this opportunity to recognize a hard-working group of volunteers in my community. Events Lunenburg County have been working incredibly hard to showcase Lunenburg County and Nova Scotia as a location worthy of hosting national and international events. Over the summer, at a press conference held at the Lunenburg County Lifestyle Centre, it was announced that Bridgewater was a successful bidder in hosting the 2008 Esso Cup, thanks to the work done behind the scenes by Events Lunenburg County. I think that many of us forget how much it takes to put these proposals together, determine coordination, and gather letters of support to show community backing. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to extend my sincere thanks to Events Lunenburg County for the work they have done and continue to do to promote our community. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
We'll now move on to oral questions put by members to ministers. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Parents are now speaking out about the Premier's impasse with Nova Scotia's teachers. A group of parents was here at the legislature earlier today, Mr. Speaker. They have a message for the Premier. As Kate Irving, a Halifax mother of 2 children, says, parents want to be heard. We are the experts in our own children's well-being. Mr. Speaker, parents want the Premier to get back to the table and work out his differences with Nova Scotia's teachers. So I ask the Premier, will he listen to the parents of the province and get back to the bargaining table and work out his differences with teachers before the strike deadline hits?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable for the question. I want to thank the parents who are here today. We share their concerns, Mr. Speaker. We want to see teachers in front of students where I believe they want to be. It's why we agreed to go to the Conciliation Board, Mr. Speaker, but teachers said no.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, if he shared parents' concerns, he would tell them that actually it was his government that said no. The only ones that wrote to the Conciliation Board, or to the Labour Minister asking for conciliation, were teachers. Mr. Speaker, that's why parents are worried about a strike. They worry about who will look after their kids if they can't go to school. They worry about how they will get to work when their kids are at home. As Kate Irving says, Mr. Speaker, I am deeply concerned about what is going on in our classrooms. A work stoppage will certainly inconvenience us, but business as usual hurts us more. They are most worried about what's going on in their classrooms, Mr. Speaker. Will the Premier listen to the voices of parents and bring forward real, new classroom reforms before the strike deadline hits?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. We too share the concerns of those parents, Mr. Speaker. It's why from the very beginning of coming into government we continue to invest in classrooms, ensuring that we hire more teachers, Mr. Speaker, reduce cap class sizes, hire math mentors, literacy, Mr. Speaker, mental health clinicians. We know there's more work to do within inside of classrooms, Mr. Speaker. It's why we've continued every budget to invest in classrooms. We'll continue to do more. We've reached out. Teachers are reaching out to us to explain to us some of the data issues that they're being asked to collect, other issues that are being put on classroom teachers, the ministers engaging our partners, and we'll respond to those, Mr. Speaker. But those are not collective bargaining issues. If the honourable member know, teachers brought to the bargaining table a deal that we virtually accepted, and then their membership rejected.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, parents are now demanding to be heard, not lectured to by their Premier. That is the problem, Mr. Speaker. Tina Roberts-Jeffers was also here today. She is a mom with 3 kids in the school system, Mr. Speaker. She doesn't want to see a strike, but she makes it very clear. She said, and I quote, "I trust teachers more than the government." Mr. Speaker, I'd like to ask the Premier, why do parents like Tina trust teachers more than his government?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I have said many times across this province, there's no greater profession that can have a long-lasting impact on our province than the teachers who do every day in our classroom, Mr. Speaker. Every member in this House, Mr. Speaker, would know and could think back to their own experiences in the classrooms in our education system, and with fond memories of teachers who've had a lasting impact on them, Mr. Speaker. We've continued to deal with the challenges that were before us when we came into government, Mr. Speaker. There was $65 million cut out of classrooms by the former government and a 7.5% pay raise. We've taken a different model, Mr. Speaker. We put a 3% pay raise on the table. And I want to say, Mr. Speaker, it was exactly the deal that was brought to us by the teachers union themselves, along with their lawyer, Mr. Speaker, who laid that out, said they know when we went, we had 0, 0, 0, 1, and 1. Mr. Speaker, it's important to clarify all of this. Long service award be frozen at current years and current salary. They came back and said, we want 0, 0, 1, and 2, and long service award thrown at current years and retirement salary, Mr. Speaker. We virtually agreed to what they brought to the table, and at the same time, we're going to continue to focus on the classrooms.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Premier is telling Nova Scotians that not one will lose a dime under this deal he is offering teachers. Since last year, the cost of groceries has increased by 1%. The cost of transportation is up 3.6%. Mr. Speaker, a 2-year wage freeze is the same as a cut. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier acknowledge that freezing wages hurt teachers, nurses, social workers, and their families?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. If he puts it in the context of the 7.5% pay raise that he provided, Mr. Speaker, to public servants all across, on top of, Mr. Speaker, when you add hours to that 7-year cycle, Mr. Speaker, the cost of living would virtually be covered, Mr. Speaker. But the big difference, Mr. Speaker, but the big difference is, Mr. Speaker, that government took $65 million away from children in classrooms, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier has said that the long service awards is staying intact. This is not the case for teachers entering the profession. This is not the case for those teachers with less than 10 years in the classroom. He is creating a 2-tier benefit system, Mr. Speaker. Meanwhile, members of this House are eligible for publicly funded pensions after only 2 years. Mr. Speaker, will the Premier admit that his statement in this House about long services award is not accurate?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. Everything that has been accumulated by public servants in the long service award will be respected and paid out, Mr. Speaker. We brought to the bargaining table that we would do current years and current salary. The union brought in they wanted current years and retirement salary, Mr. Speaker. We agreed to that, Mr. Speaker. But furthermore, Mr. Speaker, this has been a practice that has been in place for multiple decades, Mr. Speaker. And I want to speak to the 70% of Nova Scotians who have no pension plan, Mr. Speaker, no benefits. Do we think it's right to add a bonus on top to those who are going into the best pension plans in our province, Mr. Speaker? It's a balance, Mr. Speaker. We need to look out for all Nova Scotians.
The Honourable Leader in the House for the New Democratic Party on his final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, the last time we saw this kind of upheaval in the education system was when students walked out of their classroom during the John Ham government. The Premier keeps yelling across the floor that his position is reasonable. He keeps telling us that he has listened to the teachers and made the necessary investments. However, he seems very reluctant to argue those points before a conciliating board. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Premier, is he being reasonable then? Why is he not willing to make his case before the reconciliating board?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, again, I want to thank the honourable member for the question. We have agreed to go before the conciliation board, Mr. Speaker. It's teachers who said no.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Health. The news yesterday, the mother of a resident at Emerald at Mount Hope recently spoke out about the abuse that her son had endured while receiving care. She feels that it was so severe, Mr. Speaker, that she fears that she will receive a call telling her that her son has died. Advocating Parents Nova Scotia went so far as to call it torture tactics. The Transformation Nova Scotia Services for Persons with Disabilities program is said to take up to a decade to implement. It is not appropriate. That is not appropriate when dealing with issues like this one. So my question to the Minister is, how widespread is this issue and how many reports of this type have been made in the last year?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I can tell the member today and Nova Scotians is that I can certainly find out the number of cases. However, I have not had any come to the ministerial desk of serious complaints. We certainly took this case very seriously and immediately started an investigation.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Yesterday, the Minister said he did not know all the details of the report, and he just basically said it again here today. But he would read it with an eye to the need for departmental policy changes. He's also said that he's more willing to work with the group advocating parents in Nova Scotia on these policy changes. So I'm sure after the news report came out that the department worked really hard to get some information forward to the minister. So my question is, now that the minister has time to review the report, does he feel that this kind of abuse warrants policy changes on reporting and action taken or police intervention? Has he reached out to the advocate group yet?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. What I need to remind the member and all looking at this case that there's actually a final report that is coming on November 16th. In terms of the process that the department has, this is an area that in sitting with the department and finding out from department members, the process has not been if you wish, complained about, challenged. So the due process is looked into, is certainly advanced in all cases. And as I said yesterday and today, more than willing to take a look at policies that can improve Emerald Hall, and as we do in the department, look to improve all of our facilities across the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This government was elected on a promise of a doctor for every Nova Scotian, and it's estimated that there's nearly 100,000 Nova Scotians without a family doctor in our province. Earlier last week, we heard from a family practitioner talking about how a lack of family physicians in Nova Scotia is contributing to the growing opioid addiction crisis here in Nova Scotia. So, Mr. Speaker, will the minister agree his government's poor handling of the doctor shortage has contributed to the growing addiction crisis in communities across Nova Scotia?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And what the member opposite, brings forward and talks about, he was minister for a while. This is not a problem that started yesterday. In fact, a little over 10 years ago, the current deputy minister who was involved with medical human resources in the province, in fact, advanced a very strong warning to communities and across Nova Scotia that with the demographic of our doctors, there was need for all involved to start a very, very strong initiative that there would be improvements for clinicians across the province.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and the minister's correct. That's why the previous government introduced the mental health and addiction strategy, the first for Nova Scotia. This government's been in power for over 3 years. There's been a doctor shortage since the minister took office, Mr. Speaker, and a plan to address it has been delayed, Mr. Speaker. We're hearing from doctors who say there's a relationship between not having a doctor and the crisis we see with addictions and opioid overdoses and addiction here in Nova Scotia. So will the minister ensure that Nova Scotians have access to a doctor? We hear from the health authority that communities won't be given billing numbers. Will the minister provide what communities across Nova Scotia will be not receiving billing numbers in order to find a doctor?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Thank the member for making the point. And what I can tell him is that any request, any work that's required around mental health and addictions won't sit on my desk for 10 months like the former minister of the NDP.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. Order, please. The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, when we heard yesterday that the Premier had done a mini cabinet shuffle involving the member for Richmond, we thought maybe he was asking that member to step aside until the Richmond Liberal expense scandal was cleared up, Mr. Speaker. But no, he actually has given that member a promotion, Mr. Speaker. Richmond County taxpayers' money remains in the account. Richmond County taxpayers' money remains in the re-election account of the member for Richmond, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask the Premier, why did he just give his stamp of approval to the Richmond Liberal Party scandal?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. First of all, as he would know, Elections Nova Scotia is looking into the councillors, Mr. Speaker, and the municipality. It has nothing to do with the Richmond County Liberal Association. But he mentioned in his preamble, Mr. Speaker, about a change with the responsibility of the member from Richmond in terms of his responsibility for trade agreements, Mr. Speaker. He's always had that responsibility, Mr. Speaker. But the signing authority rested in my department, Mr. Speaker, of Intergovernmental Affairs. We've transferred that because, as he would know, our government has been aggressive on tearing down boundaries within inside of Canada, that the minister goes on behalf of our government to those national meetings. He needed the ability to sign. As he would also know, we just heard recently that CETA is being formulated. It will come back into Canada where trade ministers will be meeting, Mr. Speaker. It is nothing more than that. If he goes back to October of 2013, the minister had the responsibility for trade, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Premier can try and pretend that there's nothing to see here as long as he wants, but a forensic audit found that taxpayers' money from Richmond County now sits in the re-election account of the member for Richmond, Mr. Speaker, and the Premier has just given that member a promotion, Mr. Speaker, and the money is still there. Will the Premier at least now ensure that that money is returned to the taxpayers of Richmond County?
The Honourable Premier.
Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. Mr. Speaker, at times he should do a bit of research before he starts asking these questions. If he would go out, Mr. Speaker, what happened? There were people across in Richmond County who bought tickets to an event, Mr. Speaker. They were provided that receipt, Mr. Speaker, unbeknownst to anyone here, Mr. Speaker. They receipted that back through the municipality. We know that's wrong, Mr. Speaker. They know that's wrong. Elections Nova Scotia is investigating them, Mr. Speaker. And Elections Nova Scotia is dealing with them and the municipality of Richmond, Mr. Speaker. To continue, Mr. Speaker, to make up things in this House does a disservice, Mr. Speaker, to himself and indeed, Mr. Speaker, to this entire chamber.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, we also know it's wrong that that money remains in the Richmond Liberal Party bank account. That's what the Premier forgot to mention. Mr. Speaker, yesterday the government made an $86 million investment in the 20-year-old P3 schools that are owned by Scotia Learning and Armoyan Family Company. Mr. Speaker, in the last election campaign, the Armoyan family made the following donations to members of the Liberal Cabinet. He made a $4,000 donation to the Minister of Labour. He made, and I'll table that, he made a $3,000 donation to the Minister of Internal Services, and I will table that. He made a $2,000 donation to the Minister of Agriculture, and I will table that. He also made a $2,000 donation to the Minister of Immigration. Mr. Speaker, can the Premier confirm that all of those members of the Cabinet excused themselves when this important decision was being made?
The Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the Honourable Member for the question. I want to thank the Minister of Education and her staff who have been working very hard to ensure, Mr. Speaker, that we get good value for money across these provinces. When we were going across the province, Mr. Speaker, her department was reaching out to the operator. As he knows, those agreements had a buyout in them at the very beginning. It wouldn't have come to Cabinet. The number was there. What they ended up doing was looking for and seeing if we could negotiate a lease that would be better value for the taxpayers of Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker. That lease did not show up, so the Minister of Education, Mr. Speaker, calculated the total cost of those schools. We sent indication we're buying those schools. In the meantime, Mr. Speaker, if they come back with a better deal before the closing date of lease agreement, we would look at it, Mr. Speaker. But we looked and exercised the right that was in the agreements that were signed in 1990.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, the Liberal caucus chair received a $5,000 donation from Mr. Armoyan, representing more than three-quarters of his entire campaign. Mr. Speaker, this is why we need a conflict of interest commissioner that reports to this House that can look into these things so that we can have assurance that that kind of heavy-duty money being donated to Liberal ministers isn't influencing these decisions. If the Premier is so sure of the process here, will he agree now to make the Conflict of Interest Commissioner an agent of this House and not of the government? And
the Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the honourable member for his question. Again, I want to thank the Minister of Education and her staff for working through that process, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there were 12 schools where those leases we had to notify by October 31st whether or not we were purchasing or entering back into a lease agreement, Mr. Speaker. We exercised the right to buy those, Mr. Speaker, for a couple of reasons. To meet that agreement as well is to send to those 12 communities, Mr. Speaker, assurances that those schools will be in place for their children in the future. Is the honourable member suggesting that we should go to those communities and close those schools?
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Health. Yesterday at Public Accounts, the Deputy Minister of Health, Dr. Vaughan, called the 1% cut to long-term care funding an opportunity, Mr. Speaker. An opportunity for who? For the government to balance their books on the backs of some of our most vulnerable Nova Scotians? So I'd like to ask the Minister, does he think it's an opportunity for government to balance their books on the backs of vulnerable Nova Scotians, like the Deputy Minister of Health indicated yesterday?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As we know, the 132 nursing homes in the province, except for those that are owned by Shanix, McLeod Group, those have multiple homes. All of the others have operated totally independently. They've operated very differently, very different programs, different staffing arrangements. The opportunity was about working together, working on group procurement, working on multiple homes with the same insurance agent. There are many opportunities there, in fact, in which savings and efficiencies have been gained, and in fact, there are some great examples from the homes of a cooperative approach.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Mr. Speaker, the problem is the government cut the funding to long-term care and then asked the long-term care facilities administrators, what can we do to help you now that we've already cut? After the fiscal year has already started, Mr. Speaker, they put them in a very difficult position. There is a lot of not-for-profit long-term care facilities across this province struggling to meet their needs of the seniors in their communities, Mr. Speaker. How can the minister continue to hide behind the cuts he made when I've repeatedly asked the minister, the deputy, through FOIPOP information, Mr. Speaker, about what the cuts were? Will the minister come clean today? And I ask yet again, with providing us with the cuts that long-term care facilities have received in all the streams of funding that they get from the government.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for the question, and I'd like to table for the House his request that he put forward in public accounts yesterday. And what I can report to the House is that, look, the vast majority of nursing homes have made no changes in the quality of care, the staffing levels, the quality of food. There are about 20 of the 132 homes that we're now working with that, in fact, have found the challenge of dealing with the reduction, and we'll continue to work with them, assist with them, and if they have any emergencies, we'll address those.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yesterday, the Minister of Health said that the use of single rooms for new construction at Dartmouth General was something he would, quote, look at. A 2013 report to the minister's own department said that the Canadian Standards Association was already recommending single rooms. The same report said 2006 guidelines for hospital construction stated that only single rooms should be used in new construction. And the minister's department was told the Association of Professionals in Infection Control and Epidemiology said there's a substantial body of evidence supporting single rooms. And I'll table that report, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, why is it that with all this evidence that the minister needs to look at this and that the decision just simply isn't obvious?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Across the province, our 36 hospitals, we will find a high standard of infection control. There are units that have the ability to handle 2 patients. There are some 4-patient units. We've done a marvelous job in correcting the problems at Dartmouth General, and I know when the 5th floor starts construction in the spring, it will have the highest standard of infection control.
The Honourable Member for Dartmouth East.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I don't dispute the fact that improvements were made on the 3rd and 4th floors, which were a renovation and you had to use the existing space. We're talking about the new construction, and the minister's report he had that well before his own staff were pushing for revenue opportunities in that hospital over what was recommended by consultants and repeated studies for infection control. In fact, as early as 2008, the Department of Health was told that single rooms would improve patient flow, occupancy rates, safety, and reduce infection rates. Even the analysis of outbreaks at Capital Health said single rooms would have solved the problem. Mr. Speaker, will the minister commit today that the Dartmouth General expansion will be done using primarily single rooms as recommended by consultants and an increasingly enormous body of research?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I know the design of the 5th floor and the entire construction is now getting to its final stage, and after the issue that they had on the 3rd and 4th floor, what I can tell the member opposite and all associated with Dartmouth General that the highest standard of infection control will be in place in both the 5th floor surgical towers and the ambulatory care centre, that I can tell the member and all here that they are extremely excited about the future of Dartmouth General.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Mr. Speaker, recently in this House, the Minister has made conflicting statements regarding the expense audit in Richmond County. On one occasion, he stated that he had ordered the audit, and I quote, "I want to make it clear that the forensic audit happened because of actions taken by this government and that his department had been very involved." On another occasion, he stated that he was not taking credit for the audit. Mr. Speaker, I wish to ask, through you, the Minister of Municipal Affairs to clarify his position.
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I appreciate the question. The forensic audit that the municipality chose to move forward with was consistent with a recommendation that staff had made to councillors involved. That was not the first recommendation that was made. The first effort we put forward was to offer to pay Ken Meach to go in, who is an expert in financial management, to help that county deal with the financial management issues that they were dealing with.
The Honourable Member for Kings North.
I'd like to thank the Minister for that answer, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in fact, the Minister could have requested the audit because the Municipal Governance Act of 1999 states that the Minister may at any time direct an audit or a review of a municipality by a person appointed by the Minister. So it's in the privilege of the Minister at any time to direct an audit. I wish to call the Minister's attention to a September 20th, 2016 article entitled "Critics Question Extravagant Spending by Guysborough Councillors and Staff." And this is a CBC News article, probably the most respected news organization in our country. And I would like to draw the Minister's attention to this article, which I will table, which includes copies of slips and receipts for purchases of alcohol, and ask the Minister, will the Minister order a forensic audit for Guysborough County?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I think it's prudent at this point to allow the Ombudsman's Office, which is an independent office who is conducting an investigation, to allow that process to proceed. In the case of Richmond, the Ombudsman's Office did do a thorough investigation. There were recommendations made to the department. We are taking those into consideration, and we will do the same in the situation in Guysborough.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Speaker, a question for the Minister of Municipal Affairs. Last night on the news, one of the men at the centre of the Richmond spending scandal said that he felt abandoned. How about feeling some remorse, Mr. Speaker? Some of the government members, I believe, are disappointed with the member for Richmond's part in all of this. Should there be an apology to Ms. Delory for a letter threatening to have her fired? Should there be an apology to the people of Richmond for putting political friends ahead of the public that we're here to serve? Should the member apologize for dragging his cabinet colleagues into this mess by pressuring them to ignore this problem? What does the minister think?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm not sure how that commentary or the question relates to my department. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Inverness.
Mr. Speaker, it's a hard question to answer because it pits the minister's loyalty to his colleagues, and that's not an easy situation. And I think it's really the same situation that's going on in Richmond. It's loyalty to the people that support you. But, Mr. Speaker, if a member of this legislature sees that something is wrong and is in a position of authority to fix it, I believe the right thing to do is to fix it. What happened in Richmond occurred because for years people were allowed to abuse their power and to control others. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm tired of asking these questions. But if I stop asking them, then I'm no better than the people who turned away when they saw these examples of inappropriate spending and treatment of people like Ms. Delory. I just want to ask a simple question. Does the minister understand that?
The Honourable Minister of Municipal Affairs.
Of course, Mr. Speaker, I understand the concerns that have been presented by that caucus. I share many of the concerns that they have. That is why our department has taken it upon ourselves to work with our municipal partners to develop the most transparent form of municipal expenses that we've ever had in this province. We want all of our municipalities to put their expenses online. We want a standardized approach to expense regulation and financing and reporting, Mr. Speaker. And working with our partners, we're going to achieve just that, so situations like this won't happen again.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Community Services. Last week I asked the Honourable Member about the government's decision to walk away from the Bloomfield project. In her response, the Minister denied ever calling this the government's flagship housing program. I realize that I am new to the House, but Hansard is online, and so too was a blog post on the Minister's personal website from October 2014, in which she did call Bloomfield a, quote, flagship project that would, quote, define what housing affordability would look like for decades going forth in Nova Scotia, and I'll table that. So I asked the Minister once again, if Bloomfield is no longer the flagship for affordable housing in Nova Scotia, what is the alternative?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you for that question, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about the way forward for affordable housing. The way forward for affordable housing is not sinking $100 million into a private market development. The way forward for affordable housing in this province is working with private developers like we're doing in Dartmouth, where we're spending $1.2 million to partner with a private developer to provide over 45 affordable housing units in a building of 80. That's the way forward. The way forward in Nova Scotia is to provide rent supplements so that we have a reduction in the wait list. That's the way forward. But investing hundreds of millions of dollars into a project that provides just a little bit, a sliver of affordable housing, is not the way forward.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Mr. Speaker, there is a need for affordable housing in Halifax. 40% of renters spend more than 30% of their income on rent in Halifax's urban core. There are 2,000 people on a waiting list for public housing. Through Housing Nova Scotia, the government participates in the Housing and Homelessness Partnership, and its Affordable Housing Working Group has set a 5-year target just in June of 3,000 new affordable homes, including 1,000 new social and non-market units and 250 affordable home ownership units. That's apart from rent supplements and other private sector initiatives. So I asked the Minister, what is this government doing to ensure that these targets are met?
The Honourable Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question again. What we're doing to make sure that targets that are met by the HPS, which is not Housing Nova Scotia, is to work with the private sector to make mixed income, mixed use, affordable housing units. Since we've become government, there's been about a development of close to 300 units throughout the province. I do realize that there is still a need where our work is not done here. We will be making exciting advancements in the near future with the new stimulus package that has come down for affordable housing, but I'm excited about the way. I'm excited that 10% of a reduction in a wait list that has been stagnant or increasing in the last decade is actually going in the right direction now.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, the government's school review process is flawed. In nearly every instance, communities are unhappy with the result of the process that they believe is too complex and not responsive to local input. The town of Bridgewater is so unhappy with the school review process of the South Shore Regional School Board that they are asking the Nova Scotia Supreme Court for a judicial review of the decision to move students from Bridgewater Junior Senior High to Parkview Education Centre. My question to the Minister, will the Minister save Bridgewater thousands in legal fees and stop the process that is so many upset on the South Shore?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the school review process. As the member may remember, there was a province-wide consultation which Bob Fowler conducted to find out how we could best improve the school review process, and out of that came a number of recommendations that formed the policy and practice that we currently use. But the key thing, Mr. Speaker, in all of that was communities were saying to Mr. Fowler, and that was part of his report, and it was one of his recommendations, is that the decision about the future of their schools, whether it's closure, consolidation, or whatever, needs to be made by the people closest to the school community, that being the school board, and that's where that decision is made.
The honourable member for Pictou Centre.
Mr. Speaker, Bridgewater Council feels her views were ignored. A member of the School Options Committee stated the committee was not equipped to deal with the job of deciding the future of schools. This is another example of the school review process failing. A question to the Minister, will the Minister finally admit that her school review process is broken and stop all reviews until she has the opportunity to examine why the process is not working?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Mr. Speaker, I would suggest to the member that in most boards the process is working because the School Options Committee does involve parents and community members who are close to the school, close to the community, and have an opportunity to bring forward to the elected board their ideas, their suggestions and their recommendations. Specific to the South Shore, when the concern was brought to my attention that some people may have believed that there was not procedural fairness, we put an independent person in there to do the review, and the results of that review was that there was procedural fairness and there was no fault of the board.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question through you is to the Minister of Education. Mr. Speaker, currently there is a school review process taking place in Pictou West. There is actually 4 schools being reviewed, Pictou Academy being one. Following a school review process, the school board will make a decision regarding the future of these schools. Indicated in this letter from the Deputy Minister of Education, the Department of Education has no role in a school review process, and I respect that. However, Mr. Speaker, does the Minister at the end of the day, through the Education Act, have the authority to overturn a decision the school board makes in a school review process?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you for the question. It gives me an opportunity to remind folks in the legislature and all people who are asking the same question over and over, getting the same answer. It's very clear. The decision of the board is final.
The honourable member for Pictou West.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I appreciate that. I guess that we just didn't know if the minister actually has the authority, and that's what I was asking. I know she had the authority to essentially overturn and fire a whole entire school board, so I just thought perhaps she would. Mr. Speaker, the Pictou Academy Act of 1969 states there will always be an institution in the town of Pictou named Pictou Academy for grades 9 to 12. In this letter from the Deputy Minister, which I will table, one would believe through the Pictou West school review process that there would be implications of the Pictou Academy Act of 1969. Does the minister plan to make any amendments to the 1969 Pictou Academy Act?
The Honourable Minister of Education.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And as the member has said, there is a review in the Chignecto Board specific to the family of schools that are involved in the Pictou area. 4 schools are under that review. That review will continue, it will proceed, and there will be a recommendation to the elected board. We have elected board members. They are there with and have a responsibility and a role to play, and they will be the decision makers. They will receive the report, and they will be the decision makers.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is for the Minister of Internal Services. The member from Dartmouth South asked the Minister about the dramatic increase in fees estimates for access for information requests. In 2013, the number of information requests has increased since 2013 by only 5%. However, the fee estimate issued increased by 67%, Mr. Speaker. So in 2013, fees collected was around $11,000. In 2015, it's about $33,000. So I'm wondering if the minister, and I know there wasn't enough time last question period, can the minister explain why there's such a dramatic increase in the fees for access for information?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the member for that question. Mr. Speaker, since 2013, in 2 years, the amount of FOIPOP requests in the province of Nova Scotia has actually increased by 43%. As we all know, anyone doing a personal search does not have to pay any type of fee. The 43% increase actually represents over 100% increase in the type of requests that actually have a fee associated with it. And I will also add that the requests coming in are a lot more complex in nature. And I would like to give credit to the department because as we've amalgamated that department, those requests are being turned around in a faster manner today than they were 2 years ago. And we are also having a higher percentage of uptake on them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable House Leader for the New Democratic Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The fees can be a barrier for some people trying to find and access information that the government should provide Nova Scotians, Mr. Speaker. We know through our own caucus that often we receive notice of delays, high fees, of course. They charge our caucus for that information. And we have heavily redacted documents often, Mr. Speaker. So I'd like to ask the Minister, does the Minister believe the Premier and his government have kept their promise of making Nova Scotia the most open, transparent province in Canada?
The Honourable Minister of Internal Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I definitely agree with the statement that we have kept that promise, Mr. Speaker. I would like to point out that Nova Scotia under this government has its first open data portal, Mr. Speaker. Every single department in government has added data sets to that portal. Mr. Speaker, come this January, FOIPOP requests that come to the government will be shared with all the public. Mr. Speaker, I would like to explain for yourself, Mr. Speaker, and for the House, what we are looking at here. FOIPOP in the province of Nova Scotia has 20 officers. It has a budget of $1.9 million, Mr. Speaker. The total request of fees that we collect to offset the $2 million is $32,000. I think that's a great return for taxpayers.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Mr. Speaker, my question to you is for the Minister of TIR. Over the last number of years, residents of Cape Breton have been engaged in an ongoing struggle with the company who owns the rail line running through their properties. The rail line, which is owned by Genesee Wyoming, has ceased operations and is trying to charge residents huge fees for permission to access the land and their utility lines. The Minister has met with the railroad victims of Cape Breton, as has the Premier, the Premier's former Chief of Staff, and the member for Victoria the Lakes. So my question to the Minister is, will the Minister direct the railroad company to stop charging outrageous fees and act within the regulations by URB?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question. It's an important one. Myself, along with my colleague, the MLA for Victoria the Lakes, the Premier, we've had many discussions with the group over the last number of years, and there's a bit of a distinction that we're looking for clarification on between the developmental fees, which are the utilities, the things that cross over the line, which the member had alluded to, and then there's also the actual crossing fee, which is set through the Railway Act at $300 per year. So the group wants a distinction on that. It probably will have to be a legal opinion, but outside of that, I would agree with the member's premise. The fees are huge. They're in the $20,000 range in some instances. People aren't developing. There's a number of households that aren't developing with landowners because of that. So we've endeavored to formally request to the G&W that they explain why these fees are what they are, and if there's any way to bundle them. So we are working that through the department, and we'll certainly get back to the House and the Victims Association.
The Honourable Member for Sydney River Myra Lewisburg.
Well, I thank the Minister for that answer, and I have a letter here that I'm going to table, but it says the definition section of the regulation defines a crossing as either a road crossing or utility crossing, and this comes from Paul Allen, who is the Executive Director. So, Mr. Speaker, I will table that and other documentation, and so my question goes on to be, not only, Mr. Speaker, has this group been ignored for many years, but the URB has a written letter, confirming they are correct about the issue. Some residents are looking at bills for thousands and thousands of dollars, while the URB told them that the highest bill should only be the $300. Mr. Speaker, will the Minister commit to enforcing the regulations and requiring Genesee, Wyoming to charge only the $300 as approved by the URB, and will he do it as quick as possible?
The Honourable Minister of Transportation.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I do thank the member for the question. First of all, just to clarify, we do appreciate and respect the frustrations from the group, but we certainly haven't ignored them. We've been there to communicate with meetings recently, and of course through email, phone calls, etc. And just a clarification on the member's comments. I spoke to Paul Allen a couple of weeks ago from the UARB. He was very clear that they simply don't have the jurisdiction to make that assumption, make that call, that they're in violation of the fees. So that's why we need that legal opinion. That's why we're going to go back to Genesee, Wyoming, get a clarification on these fees, why they charge them, what the nature of them are, how we can really streamline that and at least bundle them to bring the cost down. They're tremendous properties. Landowners are looking forward to developing those properties, but we're going to do our very best to help them, and we'll do that as soon as possible without question. Thanks.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Health. In 2013, Liberals were full of promises. However, over the last 3 years, Nova Scotians have come to find out what a Liberal promise is worth. Absolutely nothing. In 2013, the Liberals made a commitment on the campaign trail in Chester St. Margaret's to rebuild Shoreham Village's seniors' home. However, 3 years later, constituents are now feeling let down by this Liberal government's lack of action. So my question is, I'd like to ask the Minister, why has the government failed to keep its promise to rebuild Shoreham Village seniors' home in Chester?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I was kind of looking for the kind, sensitive member for Chester, but not so this afternoon. But no, she asked a very, very important question. We know that there's been some work carried out by the department to take a look at how we can look at the future of building nursing homes in terms of their replacements. We have a number across the province now that are challenged to provide the kind of service that we need to be giving our seniors in nursing homes today. And I can assure the member opposite that it continues to be a work in progress.
The Honourable Member for Chester St. Margaret's.
Mr. Speaker, people in my neck of the woods are worried about the lack of progress this government has made to improve health care services in the region. In 2012, the NDP government announced a new collaborative emergency centre at Fishermen's Memorial Hospital in Lunenburg. However, this current Liberal government has failed to follow through on this plan also that would have enhanced access to primary care. In fact, Mr. Speaker, the government has not opened a single collaborative emergency centre in the last 3 years. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask the Minister, why has this government failed to open a collaborative emergency centre at Fishermen's Memorial Hospital in Lunenburg?
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to say that we had 9 versions of doing healthcare delivery in the province under the One Health Authority. We want to make sure that, in fact, that health services planning is done with a provincial lens, and that we have the right services in the right place. And in fact, the medical community at Lunenburg Hospital agree that it was time to take a look at what services in fact should be provided at the Lunenburg Hospital, since they are very close to a regional hospital in Bridgewater, and we will make sure that they have the services that are required for the future of that community.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I'll sort of take my 2 questions and sort of put them together in one, because I know the Minister would like to answer this. The other day in debate at the NDP's Fair Drug Pricing Act, the Minister spoke about the successes of the Hepatitis C program. Patients who would eventually die of liver disease now have hope in the form of a new biologic, solved or Harmony. So really a Harvoni. So I would like to ask the question, and I'll try to put them together. Could the Minister give us an idea how many people have Hep C in the province? How many are you treating? And maybe whether or not you're going to be adopting a true eradication plan so that people that aren't receiving the treatment right now can hope to have it.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thought he was going to ask a question about Oncotype DX, but we've solved that one. But certainly in terms of Harvoni, we will
Order,
be
please.
looking at...
Time allotted for oral questions put by members to ministers has expired. We'll now move on to government business. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Speaker, I move that you now leave the chair and the House resolve itself to the Committee of the Whole on Bills.
The House will now recess while it resolves itself into the Committee of the Whole House on Bills.